There are two principal messaging systems in our bodies, the nervous system and the endocrine system. The nervous system is like a birthday email card. It sends messages quickly, but has only short-lived effects on the target. An email card might be funny or sweet for a moment, but you'll probably forget about it 2 seconds later. The endocrine system, in contrast, is like a birthday card sent in the mail with a $20 bill in it. The message may be slower to arrive compared to the nervous system, but it will have longer lasting effects. One endocrine gland vital to our survival is the thyroid. Right here. The thyroid hugs around the front of the trachea and has a left lobe and a right lobe. It makes thyroid hormone and calcitonin. Thyroid hormone is a lipid-soluble amine hormone made by modifying the amino acid tyrosine. Its function is to increase the body's metabolic rate, which just means that it makes cells build and do stuff and makes you more active. The thyroid contains follicles, which are hollow chambers surrounded by follicular cells that make thyroid hormone. The follicular cells secrete the thyroid hormone into the follicles, where it is stored in a form called thyroglobulin, which is essentially a bunch of thyroid hormones stuck together in a long chain. Thyroid hormone release is controlled by hormones from the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus secretes thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH, which triggers the anterior pituitary to release thyrotropin, also called thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH. Remember, R comes before S in the alphabet, so TRH comes before TSH. When TSH reaches the thyroid, it signals the thyroid to cleave thyroid hormones off of the stored thyroglobulin and move them out of the follicles into the blood, where they can go out and stimulate cells in the body to increase their metabolism. Another interesting fact about thyroid hormone is that it contains iodine atoms, and there are 2 different types of thyroid hormone depending on how many iodine atoms are attached. T3 has 3 iodine atoms, and T4 has 4. T3 is also called triiodothyronine, and T4 is also called thyroxine. T3 is the active form of thyroid hormone, but T4 is 4 times more common in the body. So what's the point of making so much of the inactive T4? Well, many of the target cells of thyroid hormone can produce enzymes called deiodinases that convert inactive T4 into the active thyroid hormone T3. This is a useful trait because it allows the target cells to adjust their own sensitivity to thyroid hormone. If the cell makes a bunch of deiodinases, lots of T4 will be converted to T3, and thyroid hormone will have a greater impact on that cell. If a cell doesn't make any deiodinases, no T4 will be converted, and the thyroid hormone will only have a small impact on that specific cell. An enlarged thyroid gland is called a goiter, which is a medical condition due to excess thyroglobulin being stored in the follicles. Oddly, this condition can be associated with either hyperthyroidism, which means too much thyroid hormone in the blood, or hypothyroidism, which means not enough thyroid hormone in the blood. In hyperthyroidism, an autoimmune disease is usually causing the thyroid to be constantly stimulated, even when there is no TSH, causing too much thyroglobulin in thyroid hormone production. In hypothyroidism, the patient usually is not getting enough iodine in their diet, so no functional thyroid hormone can be made. This means there is no negative feedback on TSH and TRH secretion, so TSH levels stay high, causing more and more thyroglobulin to be made, even though it cannot be converted into functional thyroid hormone due to the lack of iodine. Calcitonin is also produced by the thyroid, and it's made by the cells in between the follicles, called the C cells. It's a peptide hormone, and its goal is to lower calcium levels in the blood via a variety of different methods. It puts calcium into bone by inhibiting the bone breakdown cells called osteoclasts, and stimulating the bone-building cells, the osteoblasts. It also makes the kidneys excrete calcium into the urine instead of reabsorbing it into the body. Remember calcitonin by calcitonin, because it tones the bones by making them stronger when it moves calcium into the bones from the blood. Even though calcitonin is in every textbook's endocrine system chapter, it actually does not have that much of an effect in adult humans. The most important calcium-regulating hormone is PTH, parathyroid hormone. The parathyroid glands are 4 small lobes located on the back of the thyroid, and they make the protein hormone PTH, which does the opposite of calcitonin. It increases blood calcium. In order to increase blood calcium, it stimulates the osteoclasts, which break down bone, moving calcium out of the bone and into the blood. It also stimulates the kidneys to reabsorb calcium into the body instead of excreting it, the exact opposite of what calcitonin does. Finally, PTH indirectly increases the absorption of calcium from food by converting vitamin D into the hormone calcitriol, which acts on the gut to increase absorption of calcium from the GI tract. The reasoning behind its last effect is less obvious. To understand this, you have to remember that bones are made up of calcium and phosphate. So when you release calcium out of the bones, phosphate inevitably comes with it. But you don't want to add phosphate to the blood, you just want to increase calcium. So PTH also triggers the excretion of phosphate from the kidneys via the urine to get rid of the extra phosphate that came out of the bones. Finally, to remember parathyroid hormone, remember the par from parathyroid, because it rakes down bones to release the calcium into your blood. One of the most well-known endocrine glands is the pancreas, because one of the hormones it secretes, insulin, is involved in diabetes. But the pancreas is actually an exocrine gland as well, as it makes several products that are secreted into the digestive system. The endocrine cells in the pancreas actually only take up about 4.5% of the total volume. These endocrine cells are clustered together into little islands called islets of Langerhans, which are located in between everything else in the pancreas. Each islet of Langerhans has some of each of the 3 types of pancreas endocrine cells, all of which make protein hormones. Beta cells produce and secrete insulin, alpha cells produce and secrete glucagon, and delta cells produce and secrete a minor hormone called somatostatin. Insulin decreases blood sugar, or blood glucose, and it's released after a meal when your blood sugar is high. It does this by making most cells in the body, all cells except brain cells and red blood cells, insert glucose transporters into their membranes, allowing glucose in the blood to diffuse into the cell. Glucagon does the opposite. It increases blood glucose by triggering the liver to break down glycogen into glucose and release it into the bloodstream. So when glucose increases, beta cells secrete insulin, and cells take up glucose. After you haven't eaten for a while and glucose drifts too low, alpha cells secrete glucagon, and the liver breaks down glycogen into glucose, which is released into the blood to bring blood sugar back up. The minor hormone, somatostatin, released from the delta cells, acts as a paracrine hormone in the pancreas to inhibit both insulin and glucagon secretion. The precise reasoning behind somatostatin's effect is still an area of research, but it does exist. Interestingly, somatostatin is also released by the hypothalamus and in the stomach to have different effects in those areas of the body. The well-known disease diabetes mellitus is caused by malfunctioning insulin signaling, and type 1 diabetes, an autoimmune disease, destroys the beta cells and ends insulin production by the body. So insulin has to be administered externally to allow glucose to be absorbed by the body's cells. In type 2 diabetes, the body's cells become resistant to insulin. The body is still able to make insulin, but it no longer can make enough to counteract the insulin-resistant cells. This type of diabetes, also called adult-onset diabetes, usually has to be treated by a lifestyle change in diet and exercise. The adrenal glands, most well known for making the hormone adrenaline, are also very important and unique endocrine glands. One sits on top of each kidney, here and here, above the pancreas that we just talked about. And just like the anterior and posterior pituitary, the adrenal glands are 2 glands in one, except this time they're divided into the inner core, called the adrenal medulla, and the outer shell, called the adrenal cortex. Whenever you hear the word medulla in biology, it means the middle or inner core. And whenever you hear the word cortex, it means the outer shell of an organ or tissue. The adrenal medulla makes 2 amine hormones, epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, and a smaller amount of norepinephrine. You may also hear epinephrine and norepinephrine be referred to as the catecholamines. Note the amine part of that word because these are amine hormones. Both hormones are water-soluble and have similar effects. They both initiate the fight-or-flight response in response to stress. This means they increase your heart rate, blood pressure, blood glucose, and blood flow to skeletal muscles, while decreasing blood flow to other areas like the digestive system and your skin. The medulla releases more epinephrine than norepinephrine, but norepinephrine is interesting in that it's also used as a neurotransmitter in the sympathetic nervous system. During development, the adrenal medulla actually originates from nervous tissue and is controlled by the nervous system during life. In contrast, the adrenal cortex, the outer shell of the adrenal glands, originates from mesodermal cells that surround the adrenal medulla during development. So just like the pituitary originates partly from nervous tissue and partly from epithelial tissue, the two parts of the adrenals have completely different developmental origins as well. The adrenal medulla makes amine hormones. The cortex makes steroid hormones. The body makes three different classes of steroid hormones: the mineralocorticoids, which influence salt and water balance, the glucocorticoids, which influence blood glucose and the metabolism of fats, carbs, and proteins, and the sex steroids, which influence sexual development and growth. The adrenal cortex makes all three types, but its production of sex steroids is not significant. The main mineralocorticoid is aldosterone, which makes the kidneys conserve sodium and excrete potassium. Fluoride and water are also reabsorbed along with the sodium. You can remember aldosterone conserves sodium by thinking of the N in aldosterone as standing for the N in the chemical symbol for sodium. The main glucocorticoid is cortisol, which is released within minutes in response to stress, and inhibits cells not involved in the fight-or-flight response from using the glucose energy supply in the blood. This includes inhibition of the immune system and wound healing. Cortisol release is controlled by the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. Corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH, from the hypothalamus travels through the portal blood vessels to make the anterior pituitary secrete ACTH, which stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone, but it's normally just called ACTH or corticotropin. ACTH travels through the bloodstream to the adrenal cortex to cause the release of cortisol. This entire process may take several minutes, which is why cortisol's effects are much slower to appear compared to the almost immediate effects of an epinephrine rush. On the other hand, cortisol's effects last longer than epinephrine's, so cortisol is the longer-term stress hormone to epinephrine's short-term stress response. Once cortisol is released, it uses long-loop negative feedback to stop the production of CRH and ACTH, thereby indirectly stopping its own secretion. The adrenal cortex produces only negligible amounts of sex steroids, as these are mainly produced by the gonads, the testes in biological males, and the ovaries in biological females. The male sex steroids are called androgens, the main example of which is testosterone, and the female sex steroids are called the estrogens, the main example of which is estradiol, and another type of female sex steroid is progesterone. Both the ovaries and the testes make testosterone, but in females there is an enzyme called aromatase that converts the testosterone into estradiol instead. The sex steroids have diverse effects, such as producing secondary sex characteristics like body odor, body hair, and growth during puberty, in addition to regulating the reproductive system. Sex steroids are produced when GnRH from the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to release LH and FSH. These tropic hormones then go on to cause estrogen and progesterone release in females. In males, LH causes testosterone release, whereas FSH specifically causes sperm production when testosterone is also present. Just like thyroid hormone and cortisol, the sex steroids use long-loop negative feedback. They inhibit the release of GnRH, LH, and FSH to stop the production of more sex steroids. The long-loop negative feedback is taken advantage of during puberty. When it is time for puberty to start, the hypothalamic cells become less sensitive to the negative feedback. The sex steroids cannot stop the production of GnRH as much, so more GnRH is produced, leading to more LH and FSH production, causing the increase in sex steroids that initiates puberty. Now, what exactly causes the first step of making the hypothalamic cells less responsive to negative feedback is an open question for further investigation, but they've got these final steps down, and they are a good example of how altering a negative feedback loop can have substantial effects on the body. We started off in the brain in the last video, and we're going to end in the brain with the pineal gland, located smack dab in the middle of your noggin, between the two brain hemispheres. Because of this, in the 17th century, the philosopher Descartes thought the pineal was, and I quote, "the principal seat of the soul and the place in which all our thoughts are formed. I don't know if our souls are here, but it does make a hormone, melatonin. This is a water-soluble amine hormone that is released at night because it is inhibited by light. It's involved in circadian rhythms, which are 24-hour biological cycles, and it has a slight impact on our sleep patterns. It's much more important in vertebrates that have mating seasons, as it can start up the reproductive system in those animals when the days reach a certain length. So that's all the endocrine glands. But not really, because there are a lot more that you'll learn along with other organ systems. In fact, there are more than 60 hormones, at least, in humans that have been characterized so far, plus more in plants and other multicellular organisms. Remember in elementary school when you watched the caterpillar turn into a cocoon and then come out as a butterfly? Well, mine turned into moths, but whatever. That was due to the endocrine system and the insect hormone Ecdysone, which causes insects to molt into the next larval stage. When levels of another hormone called Juvenile hormone go down far enough, the next surge of Ecdysone will make the caterpillar molt into a cocoon. Finally, another Ecdysone surge will make the adult butterfly or moth eclose or come out of the cocoon. So hormones are important in many different species of life.